So thanks for joining us on another exciting episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. I'm joined today by Toby, a neuroscientist. And Toby, could you start by telling my guests about your career and research so far?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Toby. I'm a first-year PhD student studying neurogenetics and neurodegeneration with a specific focus on dementia. I started off in neuroscience 3-4 years ago doing my master's degree, but I did an undergraduate degree in cellular and molecular biology before that. And my shift into neuroscience was very much driven for personal reasons. I worked after my master's degree in dementia neuroscience as a research technician working on Parkinson's disease for 2 years, and have now switched from a pathology background into a genetics background.
Okay, and with you saying, so as someone who's had a relative that went through the unfortunate experience of having dementia, and I know how deeply personal it can be for the families who go through that. So if you're happy to share that, Toby, I'd really love to know why specifically dementia itself and Parkinson's, which are obviously really crucial areas of research that are going on to try to find some form of steps to both help people deal with and live through those diseases, and equally potentially find some form of long-term lasting cure.
Yeah, so my foray into dementia research was driven by the fact that my grandfather had Alzheimer's disease. In a slightly morbid way, I was particularly interested by my grandfather's case of Alzheimer's disease because it was about twice as long as the sort of average duration for a case of Alzheimer's disease. So when I was at school, he was reaching the end stages of disease as I was thinking about my university options. And we'd done a little bit in biology about the brain. And I did some thinking, and of course, it personally impacted me, but I was also particularly interested in, and this is still something I'm interested to this day, how is there so much variability within disease? How does the brain of one person react differently to the brain of another person? So that's kind of what drove me into dementia research. I would like to make it my personal mission that at some point in my career, whether I contribute directly to it or not, no one else has to go through what my family and so many other families have been through. In terms of Parkinson's disease, I kind of fell into the Parkinson's research. I had no background in Parkinson's disease at all. But the project that I worked on in my master's degree, a lot of the skills that I had developed during that were completely transferable to this position that I saw advertised, which was in the same lab with my boss. And so I did some reading, and there's a huge overlap between all of these different neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's being one of them, Alzheimer's being another. And I was particularly interested in one of the questions we were trying to answer is why do some people with Parkinson's disease develop dementia and some people don't? So it felt like quite a natural progression in terms of I didn't feel I was ready for a PhD, particularly at that point when I finished my master's. So I thought, primarily, I wanted to get some lab experience working in disease research. I didn't actually particularly care what disease it was, but having experienced that and having experienced the research side of Parkinson's disease research, I'm really glad that I did. And I think it's still an incredibly under-researched field.
And did you find that experience was really particularly resonating in terms of both? Did you find it more from the work side of it, or more the people who were working in that environment? How did you find the experience either between the two, or one or the other more so than the other?
Neither more so than the other. I'm looking back, I'm incredibly grateful for the experience that I've had. Probably the standout part of my experience as a tech was I went to a conference in San Diego last year where one of the keynote speakers was someone who's living with Parkinson's disease. And actually, as someone who, my entire job, everything I've dealt with thus far has been post-mortem brain samples. These are the brains of people who have passed away. And it's quite easy, I think, to dissociate the brain from the person when you're looking at things in test tubes and down microscopes. And I think that was incredibly impactful on me and incredibly motivational as well, because I was thinking about how what I'm doing every day could one day translate into changing the lives of real people. So that was by far the most impactful thing for me. The journey as a whole, I really enjoyed. I find it incredibly fulfilling to work in a stimulating academic environment with so many great researchers, but also for my personal development, learning X number of skills was invaluable as well.
And I know just one particular bit, just for most people who possibly aren't aware, a lot of those brains I assume that you work with will have been brains that have been donated by the families of someone who's passed away, who are donating their brain to, and other organs, I would presume, to medical science, so researchers like yourself can look at them. And obviously that's a deeply personal thing for the family to generally do, to effectively give that over. From both your own perspective and potentially other neuroscientists or scientists who work with parts of the human body that's been donated, I would just love just a thought from yourself about what your perspective of that experience.
I think my experience was probably quite full on. So in my current position now, the way that it works is that when you request tissue from a brain bank, for example, you usually receive a bag with a tiny little chunk of frozen brain sample in it. At that point, it's very easy to just treat this as another specimen. But in my old job, I was based in a brain bank, and something that I did outside of my regular working hours to earn an extra bit of cash and get some more experience was I actually helped with the diagnostic process of actually receiving whole brain specimens that had been taken from the mortuary and brought into the brain bank. And at that point, it's an incredibly surreal feeling holding someone's brain in your hands. And it's something that I'm incredibly grateful for. And I think it's a very grounding experience as well. It really makes you appreciate what someone has done to allow you to conduct the research that you're doing. And it's very humbling as well. And I think it's something that everyone should, if people feel comfortable working with human samples, I would encourage anyone to go and visit a brain bank or any other site where they're using and processing human samples, because it really puts things into perspective for you, and it's incredibly motivating as well to do the best that you can in your work.
Now, I will say it sounds fascinating, and I can imagine the process from both the prospect of the scientists who are interacting with that last vestige of the person, as well as the process that I would presume that the family have gone through to get that, and equally the person who's decided, potentially, especially with your area of neuroscience, has potentially decided maybe decades earlier to try and have that last bit of lasting legacy to try to help other people, because after all, the plan from their perspective would surely know that it's not going to necessarily help them, but it might contribute to helping others, which it's in that way a really altruistic last act that an individual can do in terms of contributing to work that individuals like yourself are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we as researchers are all incredibly grateful for. It's worth noting as well, and I think this is something that goes under the radar, that yes, specific brain banks will specialize in certain diseases. The one that I worked in specialized in Parkinsonian movement disorders. That's Parkinson's disease, progressive supranuclear palsy, and other rare forms of disease. But you cannot do scientific research without controls. And not a lot of people realize this, funnily enough, but the importance of having healthy control brains being donated by people who aren't going to the hospital regularly and having checkups and discussing these things with their doctor about, oh, would you sign up for brain donation? That's something which goes massively under the radar.
No, I can completely imagine, and I also imagine there'll be a number of people who potentially will join us by listening to this and hearing that they've never even considered or thought about it, whether they're in one camp or the other. Because I think whilst in some cultures it isn't, I do think in a lot of Western cultures it's a taboo topic. We try to avoid thinking about death, and we try to avoid it as much as we physically can. But I think it's something that the conversation, particularly around different areas, needs to be fleshed out more. And yeah, particularly on areas where it can contribute to helping other people and a bit of a lasting legacy. But getting up the topic of brains temporarily, just curious of what. So, in terms of, I've heard a bit more about your motivation in terms of a personal side, but when thinking back to like your school experience and so on, what really motivated you to go into initially more the biological sciences and obviously now a very specialized area of biology? What really drove you that way?
It's an interesting question because actually when I was in sixth form, I was a drama kid at school. I was tossing a coin between applying to drama school or applying for something biology related. Ironically, biology was my worst GCSE result. I had this incredibly frustrating experience where I was good at understanding the biology, but I just didn't know how to write it down in exams. I could not follow what the mark schemes wanted. I would waffle far too much. I would never get the right answer of what they were looking for on the page. So that discouraged me massively. And I actually took a year out after school, just working as a waiter and bartender to try and figure out exactly what it was that I wanted to do. I had incredibly supportive teachers at school on the biology side of things who told me, look, ignore the fact that you can't exam well. You understand biology and you're quite a creative person in a biological sense. So they kind of pushed me, not forced me, but pushed me down that route. And then I applied actually for straight biology at uni. But after the first year, where we had taken modules like ecology and plant biology, I realized that I wasn't particularly interested in most of the ecological side of things, and I was more interested in cellular molecular biology. So I then focused in on cellular molecular biology, which is something my university allowed me to do. And then through that, I undertook a placement in a lab, and I had lots of discussions with that supervisor about, I think really I'm interested in the brain and dementia specifically. How do I translate that? How do I move forwards with that?
And that became a bit more, I assume, is where the academic journey that you were taking at the time linked back to your personal journey at that point. But one of the things I'm quite interested, particularly with one key phrase that you used midway through that, was creativity in biology. Because I think a lot of people view science as order-orientated, very regimented, very clean, methodical actions that are taken, whereas a lot of researchers I've interacted with, both biologists as well as those in humanities, there's an extensive amount of creativity across both camps, and I'd love to know what how you describe creativity in biology, or what it looks like to you.
I really like that question. I constantly emphasize that I think creativity is an incredibly undervalued skill. I think the way that I think about it is the whole point of doing a PhD, the whole point of biological research is to answer questions that have never been answered before. You can't do that without some degree of creativity, because you have to think, how can I answer these questions? Certainly from my personal experience, a lot of my time goes into troubleshooting and saying, this experiment isn't working. What novel approach can I find that's going to help it to work? So there's creativity from that side. Of course, when you get down to the nitty gritty and you're doing the science on the lab, you're not just going to eyeball something, you're going to methodically pipette things. But I love sitting down with people, be it in a meeting or quite frequently at the pub with colleagues from work, sitting down and brainstorming and thinking, I wonder if anyone's ever thought about the interaction between these two proteins, for example. How would we test that? So I think that's where the creativity.
Yeah, and like you say, I think like you say, I've never felt it before I started my PhD, but I will say PhD water cooler talk is very different than water cooler talk in a lot of other environments from what I've seen. Like, I've had colleagues where we've discussed the intrinsic elements of education, being an education PhD. I thought, and it's like, never thought I'd be philosophically discussing certain elements of like assessments, feedbacks, and so on. But it's something that is a deeply fascinating topic to discuss in terms of the various different types of sub conversations that you can end up having. But outside of the creativity side, I'd love to find out a bit more about what was, when you say about the placement, was that a dedicated placement year or like a research was the course designed to have a research element, or was it more of an industry placement? What was
It was an academic at the university I did my degree at, but it wasn't a sort of formalized procedure. One of my lecturers, who I'd had for, I think, animal physiology as one of my modules, sent an email around to our cohort saying, I have an opening in my lab for a placement student over the summer. So it was an unpaid 8-week placement. And at the time, and I would say this is actually pretty great advice for anyone who's looking for placements and things. At the time, I didn't have particularly much interest in the topic of epithelial sodium channels. However, I did some reading. I thought, how can this translate into what I am interested in? Most importantly, I just needed some lab experience for the CV. I then wrote an incredibly politely worded email to the supervisor. And rather than going on about all of the lab skills that I had, because I'd included my CV with those in any way, I just spoke about why I wanted to do the project. And I was accepted onto it. And the feedback I got was I was the only person who applied who showed any enthusiasm. So that's one little tip for anyone out there who's looking to apply for things.
And I think, like you say, I think one of the key things there, I know I've seen this from various different people's educational experiences. Half of the time, I do think we miss the opportunities that are presented, and it's more, if you have the time, if there's an opportunity there, even if it's not immediately something that you think is relevant to what you want to do, maybe it's something that you should do just on the off chance that it's relevant. Because, my personal view is we let a lot of those slip by because we don't think it's relevant, we don't see how we could contribute, or we don't see what other people might potentially see in us when we apply to it. Like you say, about showing that enthusiasm, potentially creativity, and that type of thing, it can be really impactful. And in some instances, I'm not saying with all, but showing that level of interest is also generally something that some programs might not see in individuals, or might not even get applications from. Mhm. Mhm. And I think one of the other things, like you say, that bandwidth and so on, and I think this is more on from your PhD perspective. Alongside being a PhD student, you'll spend X amount of time in a lab, I'm absolutely sure. But do you have any time to do, like you say, any other projects that you're interested in, such as whether that be other things where you're helping out alongside what your main duties or main tasks for your research are? But do you find like any teaching, or does anything like that come up that you find really helpful, or not as of yet at the start of your PhD?
So I think it would be possible. We skirted around the idea of me supervising a student this year, but perhaps selfishly, perhaps not selfishly, I want to get myself up and running fully before I take on a responsibility like that. So I think teaching will come in second, third year. I have still, due to proximity, I have still been helping out with some experiments in my old lab, which, I don't mind at all, because I'm hopefully going to get some decent publications out of those. And it's something that it feels quite nice when I'm surrounded all day, every day, currently, with things that I don't know what I'm doing in. It feels quite nice to have someone say, Toby, you're the only person who can help us with this. Please, would you mind coming and spending an afternoon doing that? So yeah, I still do engage in extra lab activities.
Point. Have you got to the point of conference season? Thinking ahead to what normally is summer for most conferences.
Yeah, so I've got some preliminary data already, which I'm currently in the agonizing process of analyzing. I've preemptively submitted an abstract for a conference in April to present that. Hopefully I will have something prepared by then. I've got another couple of conferences coming up where I'm going purely for exposure to the field, meeting people, networking as well.
And I think, like you say, I think any form of exposure to the field, publications, I do think particularly for those who are, universities tend to be very different from what I've gleaned from other people's experiences on how they present what you should be doing or prioritizing, whether it's preparing and finishing your PhD, whether it's getting X amount of teaching experiences, sometimes optional, sometimes forced teaching experiences, I will say, from speaking to different people, conference sessions, hosting them, delivering them, going along to as many as possible, or in some cases just focusing it solely on publications, or a mixture of both. And I think the differences of what is common at that institution, and then equally what is then the next stage for them to prioritize in terms of getting that postdoc or post research position, whatever they're looking at. I do think it can be a challenge, because it's not really, at least my perception of it, there's no uniformity in terms of, no institution does it the same, and therefore every PhD student is going to graduate in a slightly different level of skill sets than the next PhD student from say, our universities aren't that geographically separated, but I'd imagine our two universities equally do them quite differently in terms of and equally, I'm sure, perhaps between our different departments within our universities, probably.
Even within the departments at my university, there's a lot of different expectations. It's kind of driven by the lab, I think, that you're in. There are sort of pretty set guidelines here at my university of what's expected from a PhD student, and there's pages and pages of documents outlining milestones that you have to meet. But from personal experience and interacting with my peers, how you reach those milestones and how much work you have to put in can vary massively from person to person.
Yeah, and like you say, those milestones as well can be very internal focused, like just making sure that you're meeting that progress, rather than externally driven, and at least in some cases, from what I've been able to ascertain from it anyway. But thinking of all those people, various people in those labs, the placements, the teachers that you've had, just thinking more broadly, because about more the mentorship that goes into the PhD process, have you got, outside of the supervisory team that you've got around you, have you had any pivotal individuals that really you see as either mentors, role models, or just someone who's giving you potentially that nudge forward?
Yeah, I think right through from school, actually, I can pinpoint various people who've been very influential in getting to this position so far. So all of my biology teachers at school, the person who took me on as a placement student in his lab, he then took me on as his dissertation student. That's the entire reason that I decided to do a PhD, was that experience. The boss that I worked for when I did my master's degree, she took me on when I had already been rejected from, we had to apply essentially like a job interview for our master's dissertations, our projects in the lab. I had been rejected from 8 projects before I found this one, and she took me on. And actually, the lab motto now is no skills, just vibes, because they now only hire people in that lab who don't really know how to do things. They just have to have other skills, confidence. They have to be scientifically sound, but they would rather teach someone the correct way to do it rather than bring someone in who thinks they already know how to do it. The person who took me on in that role was my supervisor for 1 year and then my boss for 2 years. And she has been incredibly influential in getting me to this point, and she is still a part of my academic journey. And then, of course, the team who surround me now are all very inspirational scientists. But as well, there's a group of people that I frequently socialize with that I've met through work, who have been very, very supportive when things haven't necessarily been going particularly well for me. And that really helps keep me on track, knowing that I have a supportive group of people around me.
And like you say, I think as well as that social group, I think I love the sentiment of the whole the vibe of the person rather than just necessarily solely the skills, because I do think in a lot of cases overly judging someone purely based on the CVs, unless this a lot of jobs, and academia is no different, tends to recruit based more on what it thinks it needs rather than what it actually needs. And in some cases, there are great candidates that they might miss entirely because, like you say, they don't necessarily have this one very niche qualification or course that it wouldn't have been likely that most people would have done, and therefore you miss someone great who would have been fantastic for you to work with. But when you say that social circle, that network around you, how does that look, or how in terms of the support? When you say, is it more mutually around each other for that, or is it key milestones, or is it just even having that conversation about just in a lot of cases talking crap to each other because it's just a way of blowing off some steam?
It's a combination of all of those. So I'm very fortunate in that I made friends with a lot of postdoc researchers, so people have already been through their PhDs, and they make a large proportion of the people that I socialize with now. So not only are these people who have already been through what I'm going through currently, but quite frequently they have the expertise to actually help me with the problems that I have. So although a lot of it is socializing and a bit of fun, a lot of my issues that I'm struggling with in terms of coding that I'm doing, because I have no background in coding and I'm learning it all from scratch under quite high pressure. Simple questions that I have about, what's the best software to use? Do you know where I can find a line of code for this function? Those questions can be answered. So it's definitely a combination of blowing off steam, but also academic support as well.
I think, like you say, I think one of the, also having never coded before I started my PhD, and I'm not sure about your university experience, but I certainly was never, coding was not a part of the modules at all. It was very much, here's a potential tool that is a statistical tool. I think it was GenStat at the time, but I've used other ones that are, broadly speaking, similar. And half of the time with that, it teaches you how to interpret stats and how to input it, but it doesn't teach you how to really use it in a more applied sense. But when you say, how did you find that developing that skill? Because it's it's something that's quite different.
I would say with the caveat, it's nowhere near fully developed yet. I'm still very much in the preliminary stages of figuring out how everything works. I'm running everything on the command line at the moment. I struggle with R, I struggle with Python, because I too, in my university experience, didn't have any exposure to coding courses or anything like that. It's been very tricky, and it's certainly something, because coding is only going to get more and more popular, it's certainly something that I would recommend people to start thinking about sooner rather than later. I, unfortunately, am in the position where I've just started my PhD, and in my head, I had it that, first few months, I'll just read everything. I'll just read all of the papers. I will know exactly what all of the science is about. And I've kind of thrown myself headfirst into trying to get data out there. And it's been quite a full-on experience. So certainly it's something that I would say slow and steady, but start thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that really, I suppose, stands out to me, this is just from something that I ended up doing, which was reading like the Coding for Dummies book, which admittedly it's not necessarily the only thing I've recommended a lot of people doing, but it does tend to be. It was certainly a useful thing for a lot of very simple elements of code. That was me personally, though. But thinking back to, I know you said about a number of different people who you've interacted with since, but have you got any like notable scientists or researchers that you felt really inspired to like emulate their journey, or was that not your experience?
I do have a handful of scientists whose, not necessarily their journeys, because I don't know them personally in a lot of cases, but actually I'd split it into two categories. There's my supervisors who I work for at the moment are both very well renowned in their respective fields, and before I applied for this project, I knew who they were, and I took a lot of inspiration from them. There's a couple of people in the States who, when I first did my master's degree, their papers were incredibly influential in the experiments that I was doing. John Trojanowski and Virginia Lee, they are incredibly inspirational. But also the second camp, which I suppose is relevant to this podcast, I would say Professors Hannah Fry and Brian Cox. I would love, first and foremost, my science comes before everything else. I would like to have a career in science. If I'm not the world's best science communicator, I'm okay with that. But I really, I love the public engagement that they do and how inclusive they make science. So yeah, I would put people into those two camps.
And what were you saying about Hannah Fry? And I believe, I'm not sure about your. I've heard some of her, like you say, science communication works on the like Radio 4 snippets. Is that where you've come across her as well, or is that is it another source?
I can't remember my first interaction. It might have been when she was actually presenting some panel show on the TV. But yeah, I've seen a lot of videos of hers on Instagram recently, and just the way that she goes about communicating. 90% of the material that she communicates, I haven't got a clue what she's talking about because it's completely distant from my field of interest and expertise. But I just think it's great to have people especially in senior positions. I'm just a first year PhD student trying to share my research with the world. But I think it's great to have more and more public engagement across STEM and all other fields.
But did you find with like a lot of the fields, like you said about a number of those notable researchers, as well as the more public, I would say, faces of scientists, do you find that there's any early engagement with them, or enough early engagement with them to highlight them to various individuals, to either yourself? I know from my own reflections, I wouldn't say there was many scientists that I had an immediate connection with or presentation of, other than the typical Marie Curie, Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein. Those are the faces of science that I think everyone is presented with, but not so much either current faces or more different faces. And I use that particularly when highlighting individuals who are not necessarily as represented within the STEM community.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I would agree. I think historically there are far more scientists who come to mind. When you ask anyone to name a famous scientist, chances are they're not going to name someone who's still working in the field today. I don't necessarily know what the cause of that is. Obviously, I could get quite political, which I'm not going to. It's not something until now I've given particularly much thought, actually. You'll have to give me a minute on that one to come up with a reasonable answer.
No, well, I mean, to be fair, while you're thinking of your reasonable answer, I know one of the areas I'm really fascinated on is one of the areas that I think for me really stands out is the whole presentation in fiction of various scientists. The whole I made this point with Nick in an earlier video, which was earlier podcast, which was when you have the likes of the people who are presented to you as scientists tend to be either the supervillain type, or they tend to be the likes of, not necessarily from a perspective of that you don't tend to get, they're either very savant-like and main character-esque who have far more time than what realistically I think most scientists have, or you have the supervillain type who have they're a billionaire for whatever reason and I have all of this as well, or whatever. But that's, from my experience, what I've seen a lot of. But I'd love to know, like, your take on both representation in fiction as well as in real life.
I mean, certainly for me, I think I've spoken about this in some of my videos before, but before I came into science as a field, I had all of these massive preconceptions about what scientists were like. I thought they all dressed the same. I thought it was all a bunch of nerds. I mean, we are inevitably, if you devote your life to science, you're probably a bit nerdy to some extent. But I think fiction does probably play quite a large role in people's perceptions of scientists. But I think as well, no one really gets much exposure to science other than through fiction. You see the occasional interview with a scientist on the news, but it's all very fleeting, and it's always very expensive cameras doing close-up shots of a lab bench. It doesn't really show the day-to-day life of a scientist. And I think unless you interact with scientists in a social setting, if any of your friends are scientists, it's very easy to have these misconceptions, much the same as it is with any other career, probably. It just so happens that the perceptions people have as scientists are unfortunate for the most part, I think.
No, I'd certainly. I think one of the things that really stands out to me a lot with that type of thing is not. I think one where it looks like a scientist can come out where there's this massive problem that they've got to solve, and they solve it like that, which I think is a massive misnomer. That's not how a lot of problems will be tackled in the scientific world. And I think the other one tends to be the fact that it always highlights one major influential character or person. And equally, this happens in in real life as well, where you have the face of the lab is presented. Yes, they probably contributed a lot to that particular project, but there will also have been maybe 7 PhD students working on various different things. There'll be master's students who have been conducting over smaller points. And I do think the misconception of how science works with this really savant type individual comes in, saves the day, solves whatever problem that is the challenge of the day, and then goes off to the next problem. Whereas realistically, a lot of these problems, even if they look like they've been solved very quickly, have taken months, if not years, and even in some cases decades or even multiple decades to come to that conclusion. That's just my anyway.
I think as well, in TV shows, there is this massive misconception of how science works. In TV shows, it's always someone turning around saying, oh my goodness, I found the cure for X or Y. Little do people know that, you have one PhD student studying one molecule involved in some treatment for a disease, and that's their whole PhD, is in understanding the interactions of that one specific molecule. The questions that need to be answered in science are far more niche than people realize, and they are constantly ticking along. I guess the argument is that it wouldn't make for particularly exciting fiction.
No, and I think, like you say, I think whether or not it's the whole how it's necessarily presented, but equally that, like you say, the eureka moment. But when the individual can study that particular molecule, and there can be absolutely there is a benefit to the literature, but in terms of the finding the cure, it might be functionally useless for helping towards that. Doesn't mean it won't. It helps in the respect that it points to that molecule might not work, or the method might work, or that molecule might not work for this disease, but it might work for another one. And that's how those various different series of this interactions might help somewhere down the line. So one of the other things, Toby, is what do you hope your impact's going to be in terms of your research career, either whether directly as a researcher in terms of the work itself, or you personally as a
tricky one. Obviously, my answer is going to be, I hope that I in some way contribute to a cure for various different forms of dementia. That's the end goal for me. What that looks like exactly, I don't know. I study genetics at the moment, so I'm not in drug discovery, so it's not going to come directly, but perhaps a finding of mine will one day contribute to finding a cure for a disease. I think on a personal level, I really would like to get to a position where I'm a mentor for a lot of students. I would like to help kickstart the careers of the next generation of promising scientists and leave a lasting impact in that sort of sense. So those are my two sort of main goals. And if I could add a third, it would be to improve communication between the science community and the general populace, I suppose.
So I think all of them are in themselves very valuable and just separately. And I think people, particularly within the science community, yourself, a number of different researchers elsewhere on various different platforms, I do think the goal to try to do as much as we can with as little or as precious time as we have in terms of our research, our impact as an individual, as in some form of education capacity, whether that's short little snippets on TikTok or on Instagram or whatever, or whether it's going in to do various different talks at the local school. All of it can be invaluable, and even if it's that one person that's inspired, it can be a really pivotal experience. And a lot of the cases, you might go into a school group of 20, and it might be that one individual who's really impacted, and that's okay. That you made a massive impact to that one person. But from the impact side, from the communicating to the general public, and before I go into more what pushed you to go down the social media route, what was the moment where it was like this, presenting my work to more of the general public rather than just the academic community? What was that? What did that decision or process look like?
To be completely honest, I don't necessarily enjoy presenting my work to the academic community. I enjoy doing the work, I enjoy discussing the work, but the specific aspect of the presenting it, people can be quite unpleasant at conferences, and when you're presenting, it's quite a daunting task. I think really the first exposure I had to it was actually when I was at school, and one of my friends was sat next to me in a biology lesson, and he just couldn't get his head around a specific concept. And I tried various different ways of explaining it to him, and one of the ways it just got through, and he just got it straight away. And the feeling that I got of explaining something to someone who wasn't already an expert in that field, I'm not saying that I was an expert in GCSE biology or whatever it was, but that feeling that I got of explaining something to someone that they hadn't previously understood, rather than just bringing new knowledge to someone who's already knowledgeable about a subject, I really enjoy that aspect of it. And I also think that it's incredibly important that, especially in human disease research, that affects a large swathes of the population who aren't actively involved in the research. I do think it's important that those people are still included in the discussions. So that's part of the reason that I want to not just communicate with my peers at work, but also with people who don't necessarily interact with this sort of stuff on a day-to-day.
And just thinking, do you think that a lot of the problem that we have, and the reason why we need individuals like yourself communicated to that general public, is because we don't actually integrate them well into the process, and therefore when we're, as scientists, a bit shocked why they aren't necessarily as receptive as we want them to be, it's because the process hasn't been explained, or we haven't brought them with us as a community. Do you think that happens a lot, or too?
Absolutely, yeah. Nothing to add on that. I agree. Yeah, I don't think people are included. It always comes, some new drug has been released. Here is Professor to explain, and then they give a 30-second snippet of saying what the drug does, but there's none of the journey that's gone on at that point. They don't know any of the research that's gone into it. And I think if people understood more about what the research is being done is, what it consists of, I think they would probably put a lot more trust in scientists. I think a lot of people don't think that they know, and wouldn't know how to access the information of what's going on, because especially in science, there's a lot of really long words that, to be honest, don't need to be as long as they are, that completely put people off from interacting with the field.
And with you saying the whole, I completely agree with the jargonistic language, especially in a lot of cases where we definitely overuse key phrases when they aren't necessary. But what do you think of the whole, not necessarily dismissing the general public, but it's a bit more like where the scientists, we do get things wrong, not necessarily in the respect that we get it completely wrong, but where we tend to look at that as like a failure, don't want to share that element of the research. We want to share what was the discovery, not what was the errors. I
think I understand it, because people might say, "What, you spent X amount of money on this and you didn't get anything meaningful out? That's ridiculous." But I think that's where you lose some of the trust with the public. And I think it's incredibly important to be completely transparent about everything that's going on. But also in the scientific community, it's really important to publish even negative data, because otherwise someone else is going to go and try and answer that same question and going to be unsuccessful, even though you already knew that they wouldn't get an answer out of it. So I think complete transparency is incredibly important throughout.
And do you think part of the problem is, and I know that this can definitely happen in the general public sense of the word, but where you have almost both, as you said about the conference style, the gotcha moments, which for me, as coming up to the final year of my PhD, is more, some of it, the gotcha moments, I don't think add any value to the discourse, really. If the person's emitting pro-con, then it's a discussion. It's not I would have done X differently. And I don't necessarily think the gotcha moments are overly helpful. I'm wondering, maybe you've had experience or whether you have a view of that, but that's something I'd be.
I've thankfully managed to avoid any gotcha moments so far in my personal presentations, but I've been around for a lot of them, and I always roll my eyes at them. It's people trying to assert dominance. I don't think there's any value in it whatsoever. If it's a point that you disagree with, that on a personal level, speak to the person afterwards. Especially in open space, I don't think those gotcha moments have got really any place there. I do think that there's a difference. There's scope for and need for healthy discussions of do you think you could improve this study? Have you thought about doing this? Obviously, those are helpful comments, but yeah, when it comes to gotcha moments, I'm not a fan at all.
And like you say, they're also really clear normally. It tends to be the really long-worded statement either in the comment section or in a speech, and it's like it tends to, I find anyway, from going to a number of conferences, it doesn't tend to go well with the audience either. And I don't think the person who's doing the gotcha moment realizes how it quite comes across. But equally, all it does is get a defensive response from the speaker in a lot of cases. And it, again, doesn't build to a lot in, like you say. But reflecting back on more the social media side, and that, I suppose, highlights some of the challenges with social media. But before we go into the challenges, what was the push that started you to document your experiences? And I know for those who aren't aware, you do a fit check as you counted down your PhD journey.
I think it's important to highlight the fit checks is something that I started really because my PhD funders, Alzheimer's Research UK, the charity who fund me, got in contact with me after I had been accepted onto my PhD, and said, "Would you like to do any social media videos for us?" And prior to this, I have Instagram, but I don't really use social media. I didn't have a TikTok or anything. And I said, "Sure, but can I try it out on my own first and see whether I'm actually any good at it?" So they emailed me and said, "Yeah, go for it. You can try it out," sort of thing. So I made my own page and I just sort of experimented with uploading different videos to see how comfortable I felt in front of a camera. I had stressed in my PhD interview actually that public engagement was very important to me, but I hadn't considered social media as a part of that. I had thought of it primarily as giving talks at schools and events and things. But I got into it and I started posting fit checks. This is what I wore to the lab this week type things, with the occasional educational video interspersed in there. And I really enjoyed it. And I think sort of the niche that I've tried to approach is that my thought process is that the people who are interested in my field of research are probably already actively seeking out videos, explanation, media on my field. But dementia is the biggest killer of people in the United Kingdom, and that niche isn't particularly big on social media. So how do I attract a different audience who don't care about, or who have never thought about it in that sort of sense? And so two of my other passions outside science are fashion and cooking. So I post my outfit of the day every day with a countdown until I'm Dr. Toby, hopefully, which is just to share with people who like fashion. At the moment, I'm also posting fun brain facts in the caption of those videos. I don't know whether that's sustainable for another 1,345 days or whatever it is left. But I'm enjoying doing it at the moment, and I do reach a much broader audience with those videos than I do with my scientific videos where I talk about Alzheimer's disease and different drug treatments and things like that. So that's the reason for the style of videos that I do and kind of how I got into it as well.
Do you think, and I've done this personally with my own account as well, but the whole interdispersing who you are as a more rounded individual helps your social media and helps people both find you as well as connect with you on a different level. As someone who's also shared recipes and cooking on social media, I do think it adds value, but I'd love to know what your view of that was.
On the interest or the side of yourself that you're posting, you get interaction from all sorts of different people. I'm not particularly good with analytics and various things like that. In all honesty, I make my TikToks and I post them and I close them and I go back to work. I don't spend too much time sort of analysing my audience. I probably should do that if I want to reach a wider audience. But Certainly my cooking videos, most of the viewers on those aren't followers, and they watch along for a recipe. They don't follow. That's it. But my next video talking about the latest Alzheimer's drugs might come up in their For You page after watching. I don't know if that's how it works, but I hope so. In terms of my fit checks, actually, it's quite nice because it's kind of a journey. I get 1 or 2 new followers a day from posting my fit check, because it's people following along with a journey that has a clear end point, and inevitably at some point they are going to get exposed to the other side of my videos. My most viral video was a stupid joke about teaching yourself how to remember the name of enzymes by imagining Harry Potter saying it. That massively, it tripled my follower count, I think, when I posted it, and went semi-viral, I suppose. That obviously has had the biggest impact in terms of new engagement in my videos, but it's not a part of myself that I show particularly frequently online. So definitely, depending on what you're posting and the time of day that you're posting it, you do get interactions with things. And I think it's great to have a diversity in what you post, because if someone likes 3 of my videos, they enjoy them, and they're all fashion based, they might be willing to give my more serious content a go. So that's kind of the rationale.
And equally, I suppose, like you say, if they stay for the serious stuff and then enjoy the more fun stuff, they might get extra benefit from that as well. But thinking now back to some of the challenges, so as content educators on social media, what do you think is the biggest challenge that most people will face?
Not disappointment, but the understanding how to retain people's attention, especially on TikTok, which is a very short form, grab your attention kind of platform. It's not my style to make snappy videos that get people's attention. And it's something that I think is very difficult to work around. It's not necessarily a platform that people go to seeking out education, which is something that I think we have to bear in mind. You can't be upset if your videos don't get many views because you're posting it on a short form education platform. That's not what most people are doing on there. There's that side of sort of capturing engagement, and that's not something that I'd be qualified to give any information on, because I don't think I'm particularly good at it. I think another side of it is misinformation side of things. There are a lot of people on the internet who are just not particularly pleasant people and like to stir up a fuss and will comment on videos. Fortunately, I've not had much exposure to this, actually. I do get some negativity, but it's usually not around science. It's usually around the way that I look. So, yeah, I think dealing with people arguing in your comment sections and spreading misinformation and things is quite a tricky one to navigate. So those two, I would say.
Yeah, I think, like you say, I've certainly had experience with the, not often, but like you say, the troll comments, both either trolling against each other in the comments or against something that's gone on in the video, and it's one of the unfortunate dark sides of social media. That is what people will. Well, you'd hope people wouldn't say in person. I think increasingly people are more likely to say it in person, which becomes more of a concern. But that's a topic for an entirely different conversation. But I also think, like you say, the misinformation, particularly, I think, with the rise of certain platforms, I wouldn't say promoting misinformation, but basically anything that is a detraction of, well, to an extent, no, it is promoting misinformation. Some of them actively encourage it purely because it ticks the box that it is, and then if you post a retort to it, which is the actual factual information, then that's denounced or blocked entirely. And in a lot of cases, I think, like you say, with that misinformation particularly, when you have a lot of cases where you're trying to have that view and either not being promoted, pile-on effects of it, because you're saying something or the fact that it seems like your view, there's such an established camp because a community of people who believe that have such a view that their actual factual relevance. One, it's either never an actual discussion, but it's more of a shouting match. But on that topic, what's your take on the types of individuals that you're trying to reach on social media? I've got my own view, but I appreciate your take before I go into anything to that degree. So more when you think of not necessarily the breakdown of your audience, but when particularly on trying to inform people, how do you see the camps of people sitting there, particularly when talking about, obviously you're working in a very scientifically driven field, but there are people who are, for argument's sake, going to be very agreeable with you. There might be someone on the fence, and there might be someone who thinks you can't possibly know that type thing. That would be my general view of it, and the types of how you reach all of them, or how you approach those three camps, or if you see them as more camps.
I do probably see it as those three camps. I'm quite fortunate in that I don't tend to venture down the route of talking about things that I'm not qualified to talk about. I don't tend to speak beyond my expertise and my fields of interest, mainly because, the things that I do post videos about, these are all papers that I have read and, performed experiments based off those papers. It's stuff that I know what I'm talking about, and it's sort of well respected in the field. It's peer-reviewed information. So I'm fairly confident speaking about that. And if someone turns around to me and says, how are you qualified to speak about it? I will list my qualifications to them, and I will have a civil conversation with them. I'm not a particularly argumentative person. I want to give everyone their free shot to, if people have qualms with what I'm saying, if they think I've made a mistake, I am perfectly willing to listen to that. And I think that's quite an important aspect of it as well. Actually, I don't think it's particularly helpful to have someone turn around and say, well, I'm more qualified than you, so actually you be quiet, please. So there's that camp who I'm happy to interact with them. When it's sort of blatant misinformation, I tend to just reply to the comment or send a personal message and say, hey, that's not actually the case. This is what's really going on. Happy to discuss this further, or I'll make another video sort of replying to that comment. In terms of the other camps, I don't, but because I don't make so many of these videos that go really in depth about the science behind things, I think I've managed to steer clear of any sort of argumentative side of things. There are people who, one thing I really like about the community that I have on TikTok is that a lot of people will add their own facts onto various videos, and we tend to have a really healthy discussion. So for the most part, I've managed to steer clear of any sort of negativity. I'm touching wood currently. Hopefully that's not going to change.
I think the other thing, like you say, I do think we have, in some cases, certain fields are in more of a privileged position than others in terms of they are less hot topic. So, for example, I know of a lot of friends who are ecology researchers or climate researchers or immunology, and more focused on the, like you say, drug discovery side, where they have a far harder time of posting content about their field because it unfortunately is a hot topic issue. I feel generally pretty safe if I'm discussing education and that type of area. Most people have an opinion about education, but they don't tend to have a very polarized view one way or the other than the fact that you have some people who are very opinionated of one particular technique works and one particular technique doesn't, which who and not who.
Yeah, I think I don't tend to put my opinion out there particularly much. The way that I make any of my educational, informative videos is very much this is what the literature says. I'm not going to tell you what I think, but this is what evidence is out there currently. So I think I avoid a lot of that. There have been people who have asked me to discuss particularly controversial topics about is Alzheimer's disease contagious, which no, it's not. But there have been certain papers that suggest in very specific surgical instances, brain material can be transferred from one individual to another. That's the sort of thing that I am not planning on ever discussing on my channel because it is so controversial. And within the field itself, currently there's so much debate about how these diseases actually work. And, I'm only a first year PhD student. Of course, I have my opinions that are related to the literature, but I'm not going to start sharing that out into the world. I think, until there's a sort of pretty strong consensus in a field and it's not something that's too controversial, I don't necessarily want to open it up, especially not on a platform like TikTok, because that's sort of not necessarily the right audience and the right landscape to have that conversation in.
Oh, I get that. And I'm just from a perspective then on more the impact of either content educators or yourself, what do you feel the impact to that audience, such as the TikTok audience, the Instagram audience, or whatever communities we find, whether it's on social media or other forms of platforms? Yeah, so what do you feel is the impact of the work, the content educator? So what we produce, what do you feel like the impact or the reception of that is with more of the lay community?
There are some people who use very clickbaity headlines and things to get more views and perhaps aren't saying the most scientifically sound things. But I think in general, these are people who are sharing their passion with the world. Science is our passion as science communicators. And, I think a lot of people probably don't have much of an opinion on it. I don't think they see it as people having an impact. But from my perspective, there's multiple ways that I feel like I could make an impact. I'm not saying I've done it yet, but if I perhaps show someone that, scientists don't all look the same, you can be alternative and be a scientist. And if that pushes someone down into a career route of being a scientist because they didn't think they'd feel comfortable and perhaps I've changed their perception, then that's an impact that I'm happy to have made. If I can reassure someone about being concerned about whether they're going to inherit dementia, for example, I feel like I've made an impact. If I can help someone to just understand something that they read in the news that they weren't fully comprehending, then I think I've made an impact. And I think that's probably generalizable across the educator, science communicator sort of compass. I don't think it's an exhaustive list of how impactful how we can be impactful. But I certainly think, while we may be reaching an audience of 50 to 1,000 people per video, those are still people that we've interacted with and have tried at least to share our knowledge with. And I think that's better than nothing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and like you say, whether that's hopefully you hope that a few people have stayed longer than what is it normally, I think on average 3 seconds per video. You hope they stay a bit longer than that for most cases.
I think I don't really understand my TikTok analytics, but I think most of the people leave mine after about a second. But yeah, hopefully, if I make a video and it gets massively overshadowed by another video, even if 1 or 2 people have watched it all the way to the end and commented and perhaps asked another question, then that's more than enough for me.
Yeah, completely the same. And I suppose this is where thinking about the impact that we have on the next generation and whoever who might just be someone who is just generally interested in our topic area, I want you to think, what do you want your legacy to be in terms of, if you were thinking, you're looking back on after a number of decades and thinking, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want to be known for?
That's a great question. Does this pertain exclusively to my creation of content on social media, or does this?
I would say more both, because how I view it, I'm viewing us as more rounded in this public engagement, like you say, whether that be social media or generally, and our research or whatever we do professionally.
I think more than anything else, I just want to be regarded as a pleasant person. I said earlier that my aspirations for my career are that I hope that my research goes into finding a cure for some form of dementia. But realistically, the chances are that won't be me. There are so many people working on this all across different fields. I don't care whether it's me or not. I would love to be one of the top contributors. But as long as we get there, I don't care if it's me directly involved or not. So I guess my primary goal is to be remembered as someone who is a pleasant person to be around. I hope people remember me as someone who goes out of their way to help, whether that be in an educational capacity or support capacity. I think that's kind of my just remembered as a nice guy is kind of my primary goal. My research legacy, it will be what it will be. I think I can have massive goals and aspirations, but it's so uncertain how that will come about. The only thing that I really have ultimate control over is how people regard me as a person. So I'm going to do my best to keep that positive.
I think that's a really lovely way of putting it as well. And one of the things that I try to flip with the next question is, because often we tend to think about legacy in terms of what we've achieved in our life. But one of the things and I think this stems back to both your field and other fields generally, have you ever thought about how your experience has been shaped by your academic heritage? So the individuals who've fed into your knowledge so far. How do you think that's impacted?
People often talk about their inspirations, but I take inspiration from pretty much everyone I come into contact with, whether it be as extreme as that person's discovery has completely shaped my perspective on research, or whether it's something as simple as that person wasn't particularly nice to that undergrad in that lab meeting. I'm not going to do that. So almost every interaction I have and have had across my academic journey so far has probably shaped the way that I am now and shaped the way that I will be in the future. There are individuals who I suppose are probably similar to the people that I've mentioned earlier. My biology teachers at school, the way that they encouraged me and explained things to me when I didn't understand, just the way they interacted with me in general, that was incredibly motivational for me, and that inspired me to start off my academic journey. And then the person who took me on as a placement student, and then his undergrad dissertation project with him, he was incredibly influential, again, in me pursuing a PhD. And just loads of different people that I've interacted along the way with have been massively influential on who I am now as a person, not just limited to my academic career, but also how I interact with people in general. I think has been massively impacted by the people that I've had in my journey so far.
I think it's always really interesting when I ask that question, where most people, when they talk about their academic heritage, tend to talk about how it shaped their character more so than how it shaped their skills. When most of us are taught with university, you go through, you develop this skill so you can be here. And when it comes to the reflection, it tends to be, this individual informed this opinion about, helped me shape this opinion or perspective. And it's always really interesting to hear that take. And it's interesting the fact that it's been made now several times.
Yeah, I think, especially nowadays, there are so many resources online. I could have learned every lab skill I've ever learned by watching online videos. the most important interactions I've ever had in my academic journey have all come from people willing to take a chance on me, people introducing me to people when I didn't feel confident enough to talk to them. It's all come from people. It's not come from them as a scientist or as an academic. It's come from them as a person and the way that they've treated me as a person. It just happens to be in an academic sphere that that's happened.
And moving on from heritage, and it's interesting, we could talk about how different people have shaped their experiences for hours, I'm sure. But what would you like to say, bringing it back to more the impact side, and what would you like to say to the next generation of aspirational researchers, or knowledge you wish to impart to
them? Don't underestimate imposter syndrome, I suppose, would be one of them. Your journey will not be the same as everyone else's. Do things at your own pace. You will have your own unique individual journey, and try not to compare yourself to everyone else. That being said, don't settle for being treated in an unpleasant way. Come up with some boundaries and stick to them. Probably, yeah, that's probably my key advice, I would say.
Okay. And just thinking more, before I go into asking you about what question you'd like to ask my next guest, I want to ask you Laura's question from which was, how do you keep yourself motivated?
I think the one thing that I have struggled with consistently through my life is I've struggled to stay motivated without a personal connection to something, which is why, the research that I'm doing at the moment in dementia research, because the field itself has shaped my life so much, I'm so personally motivated by it that it doesn't necessarily seem like a job all the time. I work unpaid overtime every single day, and I have done for the last 3 years. But it's because I'm so motivated by it. Now, was I working in a field where I didn't have that personal motivation? That may not be the case. I don't know, and hopefully, I won't have to answer it for a while, because I'll still be working in this field, and I'll still be loving it. In terms of the content creation side of things, I love the idea of being able to reach a new person and share something that I'm passionate about with different people around the world, and that's incredibly motivating to me. Also, I've now had the opportunity to make videos for my university and also for my funding charity. I've made 2 videos now, and that was the entire goal of starting in the first place, and hopefully I can build towards doing more public engagement and public facing things as my career progresses.
Now I just want you to think about what would be that one question you'd like to ask. So now's your opportunity to pass the baton to the next person, so to speak.
Yep, my question is, would you of 10 years ago be happy with your glow up, both academically and personally today?
Thank you, Toby, and thank you so much for sharing your with us. And equally, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. And please join me again with my next guest when we tune in next month to find out about their exciting academic journey. And thanks again, Toby.